Peace and power, everyone. On behalf of the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University, I guess I better share my screen, since I'm talking. I don't want to be incognito. But on behalf of the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University, I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening for an important book talk for an important new book and some engagement with some important activists and critical thinkers. And so, I'm Dr. Tukongeni Umoja. I'm professor in the Department of Africana Studies, and I'm the moderator for this evening, but we're focusing on the book of Professor Toivo Asheeke. The book is titled Arming Black Consciousness, the Azanian Black Nationalist Tradition. He's going to talk to us about what that is, and South Africa's armed struggle. Dr. Asheeke is assistant professor at Georgia State University. He's a scholar, activist, whose research interests intersect the disciplines of historical-sociology, history, and Africana studies. He comes from a Black internationalist background. In other words, both his parents are freedom fighters, with parents who have fought for the freedom of peoples of African descent on both sides of the Atlantic. He is a committed grassroots activist. And as a scholar activist, he has published widely on Black consciousness and Black power in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of South African Studies and the Journal of African American History. His dissertation won the Dissertation of the Year Award in 2019 at Binghamton University. I'm gonna leave that line off. He passed that dissertation. He on to bigger and better things. He publishing books, and we wasn't on the next book, but he publishing books now. And he's gonna be joined later after he presents in conversation with two freedom fighters here in the Atlanta area. One I've known for a while, Sankara. Sankara is a member of Community Movement Builders and is passionate about revolutionary Black and Pan-African history. Sankara has been involved in local activism for 10 years in the city of Atlanta. You're getting kind of long distance runner on you, brother. All right. And we also have someone who's really established herself as an activist in the Atlanta area, Coco. Coco is a class-conscious New African citizen organizer supporting the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, as well as a local organizer with Community Movement Builders and the Black Alliance for Peace. Both organizations Coco can be found in Black Power Media's Confronting Contradictions. They are a self-sustaining working mother who spends their time working in struggle towards self-determination, land, and independence, and to free New African prisoners of war, political prisoners, and captive citizens. And you could possibly ask Coco in the chat if you're confused on any of that terminology, just ask and we can engage that in the conversation. But I just want to start off with Dr. Asheeke to talk to us about his book, Arming Black Consciousness. Dr. Asheeke.
All right. Thank y'all for joining us this evening. I'm gonna have a little timer on for myself to make sure I don't go on and on. So you might hear some stuff in the background at a certain point in time. But firstly, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's on this chat to listen to us today. I'm very happy, of course, for Mwalimu Umoja, Mwalimu in Swahili, means great teacher. Julius Nyerere was called Mwalimu. And so for me, that's what I understand in my own political topography in Southern Africa. So I say Mwalimu Umoja. And I'm very, very, very happy and proud to have two comrades who I've been intellectually engaging with and politically struggling with, Sankara and Coco, just here to engage with me with this text. Because to be honest, I wrote this text for as much as I could, given the constraints of the academy, to be a discussion with other organizers first, and then others afterwards. I also just want to give a shout out. I'm a member of CMB. I work with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Housing Justice League, and the wider Stop Cop City movement. So we must say Stop Cop City, right? Because we are here in Atlanta. So we must say Stop Cop City. I also want to highlight and talk about, I think it pertains well to this conversation. I want to talk about the importance of the land struggles, most definitely with Stop Cop City, but also very much with the Georgia Low Country, the Sapelo Islands, right, the Gullah Geechee Islands, as well as Harris Neck, Georgia, right? These are areas where they're right now dispossessing Black people of land. Sapelo, just recently, I believe the McIntosh County, they voted to pass 3-2, even against heavy opposition from local folks, basically like a rezoning ordinance, essentially, that would allow, as I understand it, bigger stuff to be built on some of this historic Black land, right? And Black people have been living there really, maybe even 200 years, if not something around there, right? So very much when we talk about a land back movement, we're talking about an environmental movement, right? That has to be at the forefront. I also want to highlight, just to be straight up, part of some of the legal dispossession of land amongst Black folk in the African continent. People can see my screen. A lot of it actually is from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, as well as other government bodies that basically make it legal to take land from Black folk, right? In particular, things like eminent domain have been used. This department also, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is also very much a part of this, particularly those of you who like, if you look at a map of Georgia, what you will see is very much in the low country areas, you will find a lot of these wildlife reserves that are there, right? That is controlled by the federal government. And oftentimes this has been Black and indigenous land dispossessed spaces, right? So it's important to think about that. And this is a very important, nice website, a Harris Neck Land Trust. We can drop this in some chats later for people if they want to know more about it. But it's very, very important. Some of the different forces that are fighting right now that are not getting some of the larger headlines, but are fighting for land right now. And I think that's important, particularly as I transition to some broad comments. There's some broad comments about this book and some of the inspirations behind it, right? This book and some stuff on South Africa. So in broad strokes, I'm just going to say, in broad strokes, part of the inspiration for writing this book comes out of the fact that in 2016, when I went on my field research to South Africa, I became involved with the Fees Must Fall struggle at University of Cape Town. I landed in 2016, and the archives were closed because I was supposed to do some archival research in that archive, and things were closed. And it was closed because there was a movement that was shutting down the universities and campuses. For those of you here in the US, it is comparable, not the same, but it's comparable to a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests that in particular were rocking the universities and have, say, between 2011, 2012, and say 2017, 2018, particularly around the murders, the police murders of Black folk, et cetera, right? And a whole bunch of other issues as well. There were just shutdowns across the country, pushing to decolonize the university curriculum and the wider country at large. And so I was a part of a number of these conversations. And the political activity back in Tanzania is different than it is here, given that at least nominally, the movement in power has the leftist movement won, if you will, ANC, right? The liberation movement won and came into power. And so there's a number of different political formations that have emerged that will emerge to fight white supremacy, but of course that have continued to live in the post-1994 moment, right? So what this book seeks to track, in a sense, is to track what I believe in the literature and even in the national discourse in South Africa. Note my switching of terms between South Africa and Tanzania. Tanzania being, if you will, some of us Black nationalists in Southern Africa call that area Tanzania. And then of course, South Africa is basically what the whites named it, that the Black government has kept, which is very telling. If you think of other countries in the African continent, like my own, Namibia, we were called Southwest Africa. We changed that to Namibia. Note the South Africans kept the name. And so essentially what I wanted to document was essentially a Black nationalist tradition of struggle that was operating alongside, often in opposition, in cooperation at times, and parallel to the African National Congress movement. And I've dubbed that the Azanian Black nationalist tradition. I gave it that name very much inspired by two people, one being Hashi Tafira, who was someone who I never met, but who was a grassroots Black intellectual, one of these cats who just wasn't in the academy, wasn't getting no love, wasn't getting no scholarships, dissertation awards, none of that stuff, but on the block, just doing this work, right? And it was a concept that he pushed that inspired me reading some of his work. And so I utilized that name in this title. And of course, those of you who are familiar with Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism and the Black radical tradition, I've been very influenced by that work as well. And so this was sort of an attempt to bring those two concepts together to kind of say that Black consciousness, like Black power in the US, right, was a part of a longer historical tradition. It wasn't an anomaly at a particular point in time, right? There was a longer history of Black nationalist struggle that of course looked different because the 1960s is not the 1860s, is not the 1920s, and not the 1780s, right? All these things will have to look what they look at their time, but very much flowing in a larger tradition. And unfortunately, that tradition is not given enough love and respect, even in South Africa, particularly because many of the quote unquote top universities are still predominantly white as it pertains to the teaching and the publishers, particularly in the social sciences, right? And I believe that's not an accident, right? You also have an ANC government that, if you will, pushed a non-racialist social democratic line, although it called itself a broad church, having a lot of different political tendencies inside it, but essentially a non-racialist vision that, in my opinion, prioritized, say, the capturing of state power, if you will, over the redistribution of resources and the breaking of white settler colonialism in South Africa. Now, this was part of some of their plan, although as the book goes into, there's different people who have different ideas of how serious parts of the ANC were or not in this process. And I think this is very important, particularly as it pertains to Sapelo and Harris Neck and other places in the US where there's Black land dispossession, because part of what made the Black consciousness movement and this Azanian Black nationalist tradition very important is that they always prioritize the land struggle. For them, taking state power would mean nothing unless land was simultaneously redistributed to the Black peoples, and if there wasn't a direct immediate reparations plan, which did not happen in South Africa, at least not to our liking. So those of us in that tradition, and so this book essentially is to document this tradition. And finally, Black consciousness, for those who know, you will know a cat named Steve Biko. Those of you who know some of that early Denzel, Denzel plays him in Cry of Freedom. I used to watch that movie over and over. I believe 1987. It's a very, again, of course, I think there's some better stuff that's newer out, but for those of you who want something around this, that is a good starting point, as well as some other readings, right? Generally speaking, though, Black consciousness is considered intellectual movement of students who are in the university, almost like a negritude. Those of you who know Leopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire, right? It's not considered a working class struggle. It is barely talked about as being a movement that embraced armed struggle or armed resistance, right? And so this book is trying to fill in that hole in the literature and say, no, it was engaged with this, but armed struggle also has to look very differently, especially looking in Azania, because Azania did not have an armed struggle like Vietnam, Cuba, or Zimbabwe. It was more PLO, IRA type style stuff, right? I would even say Black Liberation Army type in that sense, right? It wasn't necessarily taking and holding territory. You know what I'm saying? And if those of you who watched A Luta Continua, the Frelimo documentary, it was not that. That was not what it was. So we have to understand it in a different kind of a way and use different tools to analyze it. And very much armed struggle is inseparable from the non-armed wing of the movement, right? I wanted to push that and make that very clear, because you can have as many guns as you want, but if you're in the mountains and you ain't got no food, you're an idiot. You're gonna die. Doesn't matter how revolutionary or how many books you read. You actually have to have the people on your side. You have to have the integrated structures. You have to have a sense of who the people are and what they're going to fight for. And it's a long fucking struggle, right? And that's very, very important, right? Because this movement, if you think about it, there were a lot of starts and stops. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to the folks who are here to kind of give their questions. I'm not sure who's going to go first, but the idea is roughly 3 questions each. I'm going to do my best to be succinct in my answering of them so we can have larger Q&A. with folks. But with that, yeah, let's get it started.
Peace, Toivo. I don't mind asking a question here first. So right now, I know you were just speaking about armed struggle. So based on your research, what is the importance of armed Black nationalist movements in the struggle against white settler colonialism and the broader fight for African liberation? And so I would say, maybe, would you argue that armed resistance was necessary, or was nonviolent methods just as effective? And I think you kind of answered some of that.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So I put it this way, I would say that the easy answer will be both are inseparable from each other. I think that, but the question is legit, particularly back home, because there's folks who argued that the armed struggle in South Africa wasn't really a serious armed struggle, guerrilla classic sense. And they felt that it was just used to get money and support from the socialist countries in the world and to rally certain radical forces to kind of fund and support the ANC, if you will. But in practice, it was more of a diplomatic sort of mass movement, making South Africa ungovernable strategy, right? Some of the white leftists in the movements called the Marxist Workers' Tendency actually are expelled in the early 80s because they critiqued the ANC. They were members of the ANC and they critiqued the ANC for what they felt was not enough work on the unions. And this was interesting because 6 years before, roughly, the Black nationalist wing, 8 of them got kicked out, called the Gang of 8 of the ANC. There's an interesting history there that we could talk about at a different point if people want. But essentially, for me, I think in South Africa, it was important. And this is where I do differ from some of my other Black consciousness cats. I think it was important because the reality is that some people are going to want to fight. They're not going to, and I think, while Steve Biko wanted to stay in the country and say, no, I want to be in this country. I have to stay and fight with my people, even if I'm being banned and I can't move around as much. But y'all who want to go into exile to get guns, get training and re-infiltrate and hit at particular targets, I'm not going to stop you. The reality is you're going to need us on the inside to hide you behind when you're running from the police. And if we don't have those safe houses and those structures there, you're just going to get caught. Right. So there was an understanding that there had to be those who were going to stay in the country to provide some of these underground sources and to do that above ground pushing and conscientizing work and to work against the disunification strategies of the apartheid regime. For those who know, the South Africans were trying, the white South Africans had balkanized, if you will, South Africa into homelands, quote unquote, ethnic, tribal, or homelands called Bantustans. And the idea was these different areas across South Africa would have a level of independence, shall we say, right? Based upon tribe, things that actually didn't exist in the history of South Africa. They made it exist as a way to better control them, right? And so there was work that needed to be done to fight that, as well as the urban-rural divides. And so armed struggle in South Africa for me and for wider Black nationalist struggles is critical and important and essential. Rodney made this point in Tanzania, sort of, and got him in trouble with Nyerere because he was very clear that no, you have to fight. You can't have no briefcase revolution, right? You actually have to have a revolution that transforms the social and political order. And Fanon is correct that violence is a central component of that, right? So I think that it absolutely is essential, right? Now, who does it, when, how you do it, that has to be worked out in the details of the actual struggle itself. But it is very essential. And in South Africa, I didn't make this argument in the book, but I will make it in different books. While it's true in terms of, if you were to look at the casualty list of like deaths and injuries, or say the white army, and say deaths of injuries of the Black forces, right? Particularly the civilian forces, quote unquote, civilian forces, if you will. Yes, you're not going to see some of the large numbers of deaths on that side, right? But what you will see, in my opinion, and here, if you look at the mental health traumas and the desertions of the white army, it was huge. They had to force and bribe people to join the army because they were freaking out at the prospect of a larger armed insurrection, right? And my argument would be that if the ANC hadn't capitulated to the wider Western capitalist kind of visions for freedom for South Africa and had refused to enter into these negotiated settlements, there would have been a full-blown civil war. What would have happened from that, we don't know, but I do believe it would have been a full-blown civil war. Whether that would have been the best way or not, it's, people, we're not fortune tellers, right? But I think it was essential and inevitable.
All right, thank you for that. My question would be, what lessons can we learn here in like the Black struggle, independent Black struggle, Black autonomous, Black nationalist movement, can we learn from South Africa? Because I know you mentioned in the book about like basically, you know, European or maybe like USSR money, different white money, maybe influencing South African revolutionary politics in a way, particularly the ANC. But like what lessons can we learn from that? Because you know, like there's a lot of money in our movement, and then of course, you know, we're a minority within a larger country. So if we can speak on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would say first and foremost is, so Black consciousness had multiple layers to their movements, right? So you did have something called, for example, the Black community programs, right? Those form out of like a Christian type philanthropy or called Sprokas, and there was a 1 and a 2. Basically, Sprokas, I'm going to get this history slightly. It's not exactly right now, but the broad stretches of it is there was a white woman who left, I think like 20,000 Rand to this Christian organization for like social community work in the Black community, right? And basically Black consciousness folks were able to get on the committee, get control of that money, and then change the organization to something that actually was what they wanted to do. They kicked that. If you look at one of the chapter 2, I talk about Mafiri Makisala. And she basically she runs this thing and kicks all the white folk off and turns it into a Black organization. But that money was important. We can't like ignore that money as an important something to then begin to build and distribute and do different kinds of things, right? At the same time, I think that what needs to be understood as always, right? And I think even, you know, Huey talks about this, right? You know, you have like your above ground movement, right? That kind of agitates and does particular things, right? Then you have your underground movement that also is kind of, you know, parallel, right, and is doing different things, right, but it's parallel to that. So when the above ground thing gets cut, then the structures are already there, right? So I think that one of the lessons to be learned is that self-sufficiency is essential for independence. In our CMB group, right, many of us have been engaging with Cabral, right? And if you think about Cabral, part of also what makes him very independent and be able to do certain types of things is because they were not being funded super heavy by the USSR or China or the Eastern socialist countries as maybe others were, right? And so it enabled a particular kind of an independence of thinking and thought and building, right? That I think others didn't have. So I think one of the lessons is self-sufficiency and understanding that if you read some of the CIA documents, for example, part of their worry of Black consciousness is that they're not taking money from people. So they don't actually have to do what people say. They didn't need the money in the first place. It's why the ANC actually suspends its armed struggle in 1991, but Black consciousness is able to last until 1993 because they were independent. They were living off the land. They had been basically doing like self-help, think of Garveyite self-help programs as ways to fund the movement themselves. They created taxi businesses. They were chicken farmers. They sold, they hustled on the streets, right? Doing different kinds of things, right? And they pooled that money together, and that money became what they used to get what they needed to get. They also were able to network at different points with ZANU, the Zimbabwean movement, to get guns and ammunition in the transition that they had in 1980, right? So because they had this independence, they were able just to do a lot of things that others could not do, right? And actually, the only reason why they stopped in 1993 is that their key commander and their key unit does get caught at some point. And in order to, and once they get caught, it kind of hurts other things, right? And they have to stop in 93. So I think that being independently funded just keeps you going more. Simultaneously, having some funding is useful, particularly if you have a political direction in how you're using it. And there's transparency and clearness about what you're doing with some of the funds, right? In the organization, that is, right? There is clearness in what's happening, right? So I think that is very, very important. I think that's what marked BC as very unique.
So speaking of, you know, race and racial differences that existed within South Africa, obviously this, you know, different, I guess, you know, white nationalists and Black nationalists. Would you say in your research that there was a merging of, you know, white and Black nationalists struggling for a more multinational society? Is that something, because, you know, just comparing to some of the struggles that we see contemporary, you know, struggles that we see, current struggles that we see, you know, Black nationalism is not always at the forefront of things, and where multinational struggles seem to be, you know, that diversity that a lot of times we've been indoctrinated into have come to the forefront. So would you say that that is something that existed, was useful to the struggle, if it did exist?
Good question. So let me throw this out like this. I didn't talk about this as much in the book, maybe as I should have, or as I should have, but just in brief, if you will, say 85% of the population is Black, and that is divided among, say, Xhosa, Zulu, Pedi, Shangaan, and different ethnic groups. I guess the predominant groups, quote unquote, would be Zulu and Xhosa, right? Then you have what's called the Indian population, but I don't like calling it the Indian population. I like saying South Asian because there are folks from Pakistan, folks from different places, right? But of course, before partition, when the majority of the South Asian population is coming, it's called India, right? So true. But they're heavy in places like Durban, which is in KwaZulu-Natal. Hence, they had a particular relationship with the Zulus that others did not have, particularly with Gandhi, who was actually trying to basically step on the Blacks to prove the whites that we actually deserve to be highly ranked in the empire, right? People talk about Gandhi's activism in South Africa, right? He was a straight chauvinist and racist. I mean, it was what it was, right? And he had no intention of working with the Blacks as they were uprising against the British, et cetera. But you have that class. And then you have, but a lot of the workers are working on the sugar plantations. And those of us in the Caribbean and US know what those are. They are working on the sugar plantation, which does make them the workers a little bit different, right? And you have the Muslim and Hindu tensions, some of the caste tensions within there that at times played themselves out in Black consciousness and in different formations afterwards, right? Then you have what's called the so-called colored population. It's called so-called. I guess you could argue in the Caribbean sense, you call it the mulatto population, right? It's no longer, this term is no longer used a lot, but if you will, light-skinned, quote unquote, mixed race population, right? The reason why we say so-called is because many of them are mixed from different types of ethnic groups that even go beyond the Bantu groups, right? And there's been levels of control, particularly in Cape Town, you'll find a lot of so-called coloreds in Cape Town, right? They've actually maneuvered the colored question, the Democratic Alliance, the DA, which is basically the racist party transition from pre-94. They've maneuvered those tensions to control Cape Town and the wider Western Cape, which is kind of crazy, right? Then you have your white population, which is split between your, say, Anglo, English-speaking white population, to say broadly British, broadly, and then your Boer population, Afrikaner, the Dutch, if you will, descendants, if you will, right? And so within that, to your point, yes, you know, what the ANC does in the international sphere in order to acquire the most funds and support, and of course, in alignment with some of the ruling class interests of, shall we say, those in the ANC, they do push this idea of, again, this thing shifts. At first, it's multiracialism, and then they call it non-racialism, kind of taking the PAC's non-racialism, but so I'm going to call it non-racialism for now, because that's what it was for the most of their, you know, the history we're talking about, right? They maneuver that to say, we don't see color, and we're fighting against racism, and to fight against racism, we can't see color. We have to actually understand the struggle. We are human beings, and we're fighting for a wider struggle, and actually color itself. We never called ourselves Black before the white people came, so we want to actually understand each other as all having a claim to South Africa. Hence, in 54, 55, the Freedom Charter, them having that very famous clause saying the land belongs to all who live in it, both Black and white. That's where the Black nationalists split. And of course, understandably, this is why in the international arena, right, there was a lot of negativity toward the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, right? And then the Black consciousness movement, because they were clearly about being Black. And they were very clear that if you're going to be, so Biko says, if you're going to be living, he talks about non-racialism, but he's being tricky because he's banned and he has to say things in a tricky way. But what he's saying is, you're going to be living in an African country. African rules, African societies, and African norms, and African redistributions. And if you got a problem with that, you can bounce, right? So he just didn't use the word Black because he couldn't in the particular moment because he's banned and he has to be careful about some things he's saying, right? And he is trying to appeal to certain things, but it was mostly an appeal to the wider world, shall we say, and it did enable the ANC to get a lot of funding and support and legitimacy in ways the other Black movement, the Black nationalists did not. So I think in that sense, I think that's where maybe you will see this. So for example, Oliver Tambo in 1970, in a letter he writes that I cite in another article I wrote, he actually agreed with the Black consciousness definition of Black. So Black consciousness, if you will, similar to what Rodney's talking about the Caribbean in Groundings with My Brothers, he defines Black, or Black consciousness defined Black as a social condition where you have, if you will, the different African ethnic groups with the South Asians, with the so-called coloreds being Black. That was how they understood Black. right? Now, of course, that doesn't mean you're the same or everything is the same, right? You have your different ethnic groups, you have the different colorisms within the space, right? And cultures within the space that no one denied that, right? But the idea was it's a political definition, right? Against white supremacy. The ANC rejected that, right? And they argued for a rainbow nation where you have Africans, South Asians, coloreds, whites, hence a rainbow nation, and we all come together and we begin to dissolve the color thing. And that's alluring, as you can imagine, for a number of Black people, right? And even now you do have a Black nationalist tendency, they call it, within the ANC. Those of you who've been paying attention to South African politics, Jacob Zuma would be considered an embodiment of this tendency, if you will, right? Of the Black national, although he was the Black nationalist wing within the party, right? And then the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, even though he does come in his young days from a Black consciousness background, although some of my friends were critiquing me on this back home, like, nah, Toivo, he was lying, he never was down. I'm like, all right, cool, you know, he was 19, 20, maybe he was, then he changed, like, you know, like that. But he would be the opposite extreme, saying, no, that's not what we're fighting for, right? Thabo Mbeki, those of you who know Thabo Mbeki, Nelson Mandela would be on that wing. I would put Winnie Madikizela Mandela on the Black nationalist wing within the ANC, right? And so I think in that sense, if I'm answering your question correctly, this is, so please come again if I'm not answering it fully, that is what I think begins to happen in South Africa. And so I think, but if you think about on the ground, who's really fighting and dying, it's the Black folks, man. It's the African folks in the townships. We're hitting 90%, I think I would say, of the casualties are us, right? So the reality is on the ground, and part of what Black consciousness is saying, yo, on the ground, it is Black folk, and they're saying that this is what they want, right? But the ANC, because they had the global media, they knew how to talk to the different global form. They had the leftist literature, the Jacobins, if you will. They had the PSL. They had some of these different, to kind of make these, they had some of these spaces, right? They could talk, they could now control the narrative in a way that did silence and marginalize the other folks, right? And indeed, as I write in the book, there were some internal issues that was messing up these movements too, and on the Black nationalists. And as we know, just because we're Black nationalists don't mean we do the right thing all the time, right? And so that those things also hurt us as we began to organize. But I would argue the heartbeat of that struggle, it's always Black nationalists. It's just now who is more organized to maneuver that energy to take power and to dictate terms.
Before we take the next question, I just want to remind folks who are listening or viewing that you could put questions in the Q&A part. We'll have one or two more questions from the panel, and then we'll open it up for other folks. So Sankara, got any more for us?
Yeah, I'm definitely learning a lot even from this. I guess we could talk about the aftermaths, right? The aftermaths of both kind of civil rights, Black Power movement, some of the anti-colonial movements. What are some of the parallels that you see between like kind of South Africa post apartheid and maybe the Black, our condition here post kind of like, you know, we want to say Civil Rights Act? Like what are some of the parallels and differences in some of the aftermaths of when we supposedly win or whatever?
No, great question. I mean, let's just take, since we're here in Atlanta, let's just take this, right? It's an imperfect comparison, so I don't want people to say, you know, that this is an exact comparison. It's not, right? But just to kind of think through as much as we can globally and just kind of comparatively, right? I mean, Black folk do take power in Atlanta at some point, right? It's true. In Atlanta, in certain parts, if you compare to other parts in the US since Reconstruction, Atlanta, there is a history of a Black political power base that's here in the South that is actually unique, right? Maynard Jackson and them actually are a part of a wave of some interesting power waves, right? Now, of course, people like Mayor Jackson, I want to say Washington, and I think I want to say Henry Washington, I'm going to spell his name wrong, but basically the mayor of Chicago in the 1980s, I want to say it's Harry Washington, right? Essentially what they do is they kind of run on these progressive platforms in certain ways, but then quietly make these negotiations and side deals with the white state, right? So not necessarily the federal government, but the state of Georgia or of Illinois, right? And they sort of basically capitulate on that type of level, right? Where they kind of say, well, we'll for now concede certain things in the city to you, right? But you're still actually within the logic of capitalism. You're still within our logics of certain things, right? And then, but you will be in power in ways people had not been before, right? Harold Washington, there we go. I think, yeah, Harold Washington. Harold Washington. Yes, Harold Washington, right? So you have some of this that happens there, right? I mean, you have a rash in the US actually of like Black mayors that come to power, right? In DC, right? I believe Marion Barry, right? You have a whole bunch of people who come into certain types of electoral power, right? Even Baraka, right, is a part of a whole swing in New Jersey, right, to put people in, to certain people in power, right? So in some sense, what you have is you have that, right? But of course, these white folks don't give nothing away for free, right? And it actually is part of a plan, and in some ways, it actually is more efficient, right? Similar to South Africa, the argument being, well, let the ANC come into power, they'll win, right? We maneuver things that the ANC wins, and they actually can keep the masses subjugated in a, better, right? And they can get back to the mines, they can get back to the farms and work for the agro industries, right? They can get back to things, you know what I'm saying, as normal. We don't have to have any systemic structural change. If you go to Johannesburg and Cape Town now, yes, you're gonna find more Black faces in particular places, but the architecture of the city is still in a colonial city. It's still an apartheid city, right? If you're in particular places in Cape Town, you won't know you're in Africa. You'll think you're in some Dutch place or in some European place, right? Because of the segregation after 5, and Windhoek, where I'm from, Windhoek, Namibia is a colonial city, right? Literally Windhoek, Namibia, the downtown area, the main city area, after 5, 6 p.m., Black people aren't really there. Why? Because we were segregated in the township, in the hood, right, in the projects. So everybody goes back there, right? And you know what I'm saying? So even that very architecture stays the same, right? In the rural areas, for example, there was no land redistribution, right? And if you want to compare with the United States, for example, again, let's take Atlanta and Georgia. Some of the biggest Georgia land dispossessions happened between the 50s and the 70s, right? That post-World War II moment up until the 1970s, when we're supposed to, apparently, particularly from the 60s onwards, right? We're supposed to have Black leadership, right? But there's land dispossessions that are happening. They're happening right now in South Africa and Namibia right now, right? There's people, literally the foreign, these multinational companies, which are going into the areas of South Africa right now and are dispossessing people of land. Or in Namibia, you have these fracking companies that can't frack in the US legally. So they make these side deals with SWAPO people, basically, and they're illegally fracking in some of these areas in Namibia, which is poisoning the groundwater. And some of the, if you will, the indigenous San people, right, who live in these areas are being poisoned by that water. Those are some of the parallels, right? Because again, if you're not going to attack the structural nature of oppression and apartheid, right, then these things are just going to continue to happen, right? Right? Even if you look in the United States, right, if you look at from the 1960s, there's some numbers I was looking at a while ago. Yes, you have more numeric Black people who are in the quote unquote middle class and upper class. Yes, that's true, numerically, right? But this is not proportionate. You know what I'm saying? The actual impoverishment percentage has gotten larger. So the inequalities have actually even gotten worse since quote unquote integration. Actually, with what segregation did do, in many ways, right? Was you could only go so far, right? In the hood, right? You could only go so far in the Black area. You actually have to be you couldn't leave the hood. You actually had to be there, right? But when you have this quote unquote integration in Black, just like, whatever, what happens after the 60s, right? You then have a huge bifurcation within Black, on a class level, right? With a small percentage that gets able to do this, while most either stay stable or actually have gotten worse, right? Since the 60s and 70s, right? Something similar scarily has happened in South Africa too. You do have an elite that comes from those who came into state power. Like myself, I'm a product of that, right? SWAPO won, and my father was levels of prominent in the party. So I had access to an upper middle class lifestyle that most Black Namibians didn't. Right? And that right there itself is an embodiment. Even myself, I am a child of that inequality, right? That comes from a liberation movement taking power, but not addressing the material and social foundations that created the inequality in the first place. And that centers very much on land, particularly under white settler colonialism. That's why I repeat, white settler colonialism is very, very important. It's not like it's different from, say, quote unquote, classic colonialism, right? Because the white settler colonial aspect of it, land is central to the colonial project. So if there's no redistribution of land, you have changed jack shit. It just is what it is, right? And that's what this is a Black consciousness position. Now, I'm not crazy if you now make a comparison to your point of difference. I will say a difference, and there are major differences, of course. We're 90% the majority back home. That's not the situation here, even in Georgia, right? Or Louisiana, it's not the situation in the United States, right? And yes, because they did have particular socialist leanings, yes, indeed, the healthcare system in South Africa is, in my opinion, far better than the one here. Literally, my peoples can't believe that I just had a child. They can't believe we had to pay a certain amount of money, even with insurance for this child, because it's ridiculous. Like, what? Literally, people did certain things, or actually certain types of education and certain healthcare is free back home, right? There are certain socialist things that did happen, right? Like in my village, for example, in the north of the country, we have piped water and electricity coming to areas that have never had that before. That isn't a small thing either, particularly in a semi-arid desert country as Namibia, and in this damn global warming that's hitting us oftentimes disproportionately more than those in the West, right? So they are providing that. That's true. The labor laws in Namibia, for example, in South Africa, comparatively are very good. You can't fire Namibians just like that. You got to give written warnings. You got to wait. You got to give another one. You got to do a suspension. Then maybe you can fire somebody. And global capitalists hate that, right? Because they want to be able to fire people to keep wages low and to keep the labor pool unsure, right? So it's true, there are lots of labor protections that you have in South Africa and Namibia that are not existing here. And that does change how things look. And again, we're in the African continent, we're surrounded at least nominally by other African countries, right? So I would say it's a very broad question that you ask, but I think in those senses, right, those are some of the similarities and differences, right? But what we're worried about, those of you who want to pay attention, we're paying attention, next year is the 30th anniversary of the ANC coming to power in 1994, right? And next year, it's possible that the conservatives in the South African government win a majority of the seats, right? The ANC possibly is going to hit under 50% for the first time. And those people want to break, if you will, the welfare state that South Africa had. They want to break it and systematically reorganize, particularly with the power stuff. Those of you who are watching South Africa right now, there's a power crisis in South Africa, right? That's being caused by the white folks who still control these nominally government-owned enterprises, right? And are messing up the power grid, right? In order to discredit the ANC, so they can privatize the power after the ANC gets weakened in next year's elections. Right. So yeah, long-winded answer a bit, but yeah, that would be my answer.
And if it's all right, there's a question that's been in the Q&A for a minute. If it's all right, Professor Asheeke could ask. Yeah. It's coming from Carrie Fresh Hour saying, what were some of the competing visions for land? And did you see any being shaped by the global agrarian struggles? Can you see these influencing contemporary movements in South Africa today?
Good question, Carrie. Okay, so let's answer this way, right? In the one sense, you have, there's a position which says the state has to come in and own land. And when the state owns land, the state will be the best distributor or the best allocator of the resource of land, right? That's one thing there, right? There's another thing that says, well, you come into power in the state, this is more of an ANC position. We're going to buy back land. That was their belief. We're going to buy back land at market rates from the white population, right? And we're generally going to leave what they call productive land, mines, good farmland. I mean, not to diss Arizona, but if I give you, 40 acres in the desert of Arizona, this ain't what y'all talking about with 40 acres in a mule, right? You're talking about some land. You know what I'm saying? Where you can grow things, build things, have water, these kinds of things, right? So they were buying, the idea of the ANC is to buy back land, right? And then encourage people to quote unquote productively utilize the land. When I say quote unquote, what I mean is not to produce for subsistence, but to produce for export, right? So instead of producing things that are feeding people, right? Like, like my village is like millet, mahangu, right? Like our version of maize, if you will, right? That would be what we would generally produce, right? And maybe some other foodstuffs, right? They'll say, no, we want you to produce tobacco. Why? To sell. Now you can't eat tobacco. I mean, some people do chew tobacco, right? But I don't be doing that. But tobacco, right? In of itself, right? That's not like a food crop. You're selling that to the global market, right? Or if it's, we could, sugar. or whatever the case may be, right? That would be that version of it. What the contemporary Black conscious movement has done that I'm a part of, Black First Land First is the organization I'm a part of, and the way we've been being persecuted back in South Africa, Lord be, you would think we was in a white country. Our understanding though is the state can never be the owner of land, because the state in of itself is problematic when it comes to this, particularly because the state as currently constructed is plugged into particular types of global capitalist forces, right? So part of what they have been inspired by, when our president, Andile, he was very inspired by some of the Brazilian struggles. I believe is I can't remember what they're called, but some of the Brazilian land struggles, he went there in the early 2000s, I believe, and was inspired by some of those there, right? His argument essentially is that, his and the organization's argument is that the state has to be referee, and arguing that people who are living on the land actually know whose land is whose. And it's true. Let the people who are historically been on the land themselves decide. And the state's only purpose is to provide a space, translation, food, childcare, right? To get if people need to take time off work, and we need to get them money for their time off work, is to facilitate the process of the local community distributing land and deciding what they do with the land. And that also comes from a particular analysis of traditional African chiefs, which was, remember, African chiefs is not equivalent to a king or a duke or a baron, as the Europeans began to like imbue it with that. The chief's main job is referee. You say this, you say that. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, there isn't abuse in these. Of course there is. And particularly when it comes to, a white settler colonial project that's dispossessing people, killing people, and committing genocide, yes, the chief position changes. And you have to become something different, right? But historically, chief is to adjudicate. And so I think in that sense, Carrie, is how I would answer that. Those are the kind of the competing visions, if you will. Right now, the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, formed from a split in the ANC a few years ago. Their position is that their position is unproductive land should be returned to Black folk, and some of the productive land is to be bought and returned to Black people. That was a shift in their political position from when they first split, and because BLF was part of EFF at first, but we split with them when they made what we believe was a concession. Our position was all land has to come back, right? But they changed that at a key moment, and that, as well as other things, precipitated the split between the BLF and the EFF. So I would say, Carrie, those are some of the broad broad ideas of land, shall we say? And I will also say each of the ethnic groups have their own unique understanding of what land is and is not.
We have two more questions. And I was going to ask mine, but I'm going to let them go get there since I got more access to you. First, from V. Starks, what is solidarity between urban Black nationalists and rural, non-urban Black communities look like within the South African context? And how do you feel that can inspire greater solidarity between, say, Black folks living in the Atlanta metro area in support of Sapelo Island and Harris Neck struggles?
Okay, so let me try to say it like this, right? Because this might be fun. It's interesting to me how certain folks coming from rural Georgia come to Atlanta and they think it's like this huge metropolis of the city. Particularly if you've been in New York City, right? It's like Atlanta ain't no huge city as it pertains to cities, right? But
watch that. Go ahead.
But
I'm playing with you.
We got LA, we got, this is some cities, you know what I'm talking about. And Johannesburg is like that. Johannesburg, I actually think it's very LA-ish in terms of its sprawl, right? It's like it has land to it, right? And that actually was on purpose, but it's a mining town, and you have to keep the Blacks away from the whites, and the Blacks in the majority. So you need space, particularly if your labor force is Black, right? And so some of the differences I would say would be the difference between, yes, what does it mean to be Black in New York City or Atlanta is not necessarily the same experience as if you lived in rural Georgia, in Valdosta or Brunswick, or even Savannah or other places your entire life, right? There's different understandings, right? So for example, in my class, my intro class, it's like 40 students there. I asked them how many people have worked on a farm. No one raised their hand. I asked people how many people have a garden. only 3 raised their hand. There's a time that would never be the case if you were at Savannah State or if you were somewhere else in rural Georgia. It wouldn't be the case, right? People have been around land. They know animals, they know crops, they know some of these things, right? And so I think the first step is to acknowledge that there is a difference, right? And it's to also acknowledge that the cities have a disproportionate, Atlanta in particular, has a disproportionate interest. Yeah, generational, absolutely, Malimu. There's a particular interest, right? That each spot has as it pertains to land and even themselves, even their confrontations with white folks, right? It's very, very different how some of the things move in some of these places, right? And I'm speaking on Georgia because we're here in Georgia, right? I'm sure it's similar in Alabama, Mississippi. I mean, New Orleans would not necessarily be the same as everywhere in Louisiana, right? There's going to be differences in some of these places, right? So I think, Vida, really to answer your question, I think what's important, right, is that what solidarity first means is understanding each other's struggle, 1. 2, I remember an organizer who I was talking with before I came down to Atlanta. Part of her critique she felt, or they felt, of Atlanta radicalism, or Atlanta radical movements, was a lot of Atlanta-based organizations are able, if you are able to draw a lot of funding from places because you're in Atlanta or New York City or Chicago or LA, and that funding oftentimes doesn't flow to groups and organizations that are outside of Atlanta. You feel me? Or if it does, it's very much, we're giving you this money, and in some way, some of the power relations between that are not always as addressed or as clear, right? So sometimes it's important, I think, for that to be serious. And so, for example, to give a concrete example, another one, V, when I was in the Thieves Must Fall struggle, we did get critiqued by a lot of rural folks. Why? Because all the big protests were happening at the historically white universities. Let's just say the Yales, the Harvards, Columbias, and say Emory's, right? But the folks who were at Savannah State, or who were at, Jackson State, or who were at some of the smaller historically Black colleges that do not get some of the funding, right? They've been protesting since '94. They've been getting tear gas. They've been being beaten down. But because in the historically Black colleges and universities in the rural areas, ain't nobody care. Students aren't getting their grades on time. Students have to pay extra for their degrees to bribe a professor, right? You have no running water, no internet in some of these places, right? But the big, nice, well-endowed universities, when they have issues, the whole country got to stop. The whole country got to stop. Now it's a problem. And the ones disproportionately who are going to those universities, while you have your scholarships for those of a lower socioeconomic background, the majority of them are folks like myself, who are either tied to the state in certain ways, or their families are business people, or they have some level of upward mobility being Black, so they can get into some of these universities. So that right there was a direct tension. And so part of how they had to reconcile that tension was that they began to take more seriously organizing the janitors and the cleaners on campus, who those ones have to travel 2 hours sometimes to get to the university on buses to work, are disproportionately working class women. And many of them have direct ties to the rural areas as well. So the argument is that they had to have that negotiation, they had to have that argument, and I was there for some of it, right? In order to kind of figure out some of this stuff, right? And then you saw, at least in Thieves Must Fall, an attempt to really organize some of the workers as a way to say, it's not just some student struggle or some city type of struggle, if you will, right? But those tensions are there, right? And even now in South Africa with the Amadiba Crisis Committee is one organization I would point people to. They're trying to even just get heard in the cities. And they're in South Africa. And they're not getting heard in certain types of ways, right? Because again, we also in the city have to break some of that stuff. Well, they're backward in the rural area, they're backward, they're slow, they don't, these kinds of things, right? And that know impacts things here. I mean, I making jokes on my mom all the time. My mother's family's from DC. My mom was very, very clear. I'm coming to Atlanta to see you. I ain't leaving Atlanta to go nowhere else. I ain't going to, and then she's like, y'all here going to Mississippi? She's like, Mississippi. Oh, no. They lynched all of our people down there. Them crackers is crazy. So, but that is,
Mississippi, goddamn.
Yeah, Mississippi, goddamn. But we understand. But those of you who are from, that's real. People are saying that because there's a lot of trauma associated with us being kicked out of the rural areas here in the South. Jim Crow was not just about some stupid drinking out of some damn fountain. I don't want their water. It was about kicking us off land and breaking control that we had over our communities and our self-sufficiency. That's what it was about. And there's trauma associated with being pushed out. Our family comes from North Carolina. right? And they got pushed out at a particular point. So V, that's how I would answer your question, is that we have to just be honest about what's happening and then just make links and go to some of these places and build.
Okay, let me see. We had actually two came in at the same time. The first one, and I'll just ask both at the same time and then we'll wrap. The first one, is there a place for armed revolution in South Africa / Tanzania against the conservative forces which desire to undo whatever gains were achieved over the past 30 years? What do we do with the so-called democracy models we imply now? And then the second question is, can you talk a little bit about the current developments with Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters?
Okay, good question. So I see the time. I'm gonna try to do this judiciously. So,
Yeah, man, and I have a couple of announcements after that too.
Got you. Okay, so and I see Rosita, you have a question there as well. Okay, so what I'll say this with just Joe, I'm gonna jump on your question first on EFF. So Julius Malema is one of the best organizers I have ever seen. The man knows how to organize people. He understands how to propagate his message. He knows how to speak and to move in ways that people feel he's talking with them versus him at them, right? He understands, he knows everything we're talking about, Black Power, Carmichael, Pan-Africanism, this, he knows all that literature. He knows all of it, right? He has, there's people who've been around him. He has an incredible ability to soak up and to retain information. And correctly, he empowered a bunch of younger cats, particularly cats who were big in the protest movement on campuses. Some of them who I know are currently now in levels of leadership in EFF. Why? Because they're the ones who know how to talk to the masses, right? He will go into the hood and just talk what's good, right? He knows how to move like that. He knows the different languages. And so EFF is tricky because my issues with EFF, I think they're going to win a good percentage next year. I'm not sure how much, just to be very honest, because they're still not strong in the rural areas. They're strong in the cities, among the young, the urban radicals, if you will, the people who are upset and tired of the same elders in political power, right? He did go to London, again, part of our split from them. He did go to London to basically get a sign off from the white, remember, because 95% of the banking system of South Africa is controlled by the UK. That's why I got problems with some of this BRICS stuff, right? South Africa has no business in BRICS, right? That S needs to go because their entire, if 95% of your banks are controlled by the UK, what are we talking about? Right? You go to First National Bank, FNB, Standard Bank, right? And these different key banks. If you Lenin style, if you go back, to their originator, where they're like these joint stock things, right? If you go back, they're all London based, right? He basically goes there and to tell them that, we're not going to take all the land. We're only going to take unproductive land, and we will have a buyback program in certain places, et cetera, et cetera. He's done that. They also have, as a way to kick the ANC out of local powers like mayorships and local councilorships, they formed alliances with the DA in particular locations, right? I mean, that would be as if someone said the Black Panther Party formed an alliance with the moderate Republicans, or the moderate Dixiecrats, whatever, to take power to kick out the Republicans. I mean, I'm just trying to make a rough, it's a weird thing, right? And some of us don't get that, right? But the idea is we can get in power this way, right? I do think he's going to win more votes next year. My sensibility, the way that works there is if you win, is that what they're going to do, in my opinion, is let's say South Africa, say ANC gets 45% of the vote and EFF gets 25% of the vote, they will have a joint government. And my argument is that the EFF will then have a joint government with them where Malema, maybe not president, but he's going to have a very top high-ranking position in the government, and many of his people will be there, or they won't form a coalition government with them, and we may have stalemate in South African politics. Next year is going to be explosive in Tanzania. That's what I would answer, Joe, to your question. And an armed revolution in Tanzania right now against conservative forces. Listen, people are already doing that because in Amadiba Crisis Committee, these multinational companies have hired hitmen to shoot people in those areas who are resisting selling their land. The people have formed self-defense committees in resistance to that, and they already are doing that. Right? And so that stuff is actually already happening. It's just not for correct reasons, right? They're not putting it on Twitter, on Instagram. Yo, just shot some people today. No. It's just quiet work. This is not work that you're going to be posting on the gram so that every leftist can see you and then like your status and then put you on some show, right? They have to defend their community. They can't know who's doing this stuff. You see, so I think it already is taking place right now, right? Now, whether it breaks out in large scales, the problem with South Africa right now is, those of you who know, it's true. I hate saying black on black crime because we know it's all bullshit, that stuff, right? But if you will, some of the crime rates are actually ridiculous. The home invasion rates, I mean, people are just killing people. It is kind of wild. It is. And that, of course, is confusing the masses in particular ways, right? And they're unable to respond in particular ways to things. But people are, particularly in the rural areas where there's still a large white population, they are resisting in particular kinds of ways. Yeah, intercommunal violence is a better word, absolutely, right? So I will say it's already happening. Whether it's large scale or not, it depends on, of course, who's going to be directing that. And so what I would say is that in South Africa, local, because of their history, particularly in the 1980s of mass struggle, because the ANC and BCM and PAC weren't strong enough militarily to challenge the apartheid state in the field in certain ways, they had to distribute weapons amongst the wider masses, right? To allow people independently and spontaneously, right, to hit at the regime and oftentimes at each other. So locally, people have strong self-defense organizations, like in your block, in your hood, right? They have really good, or in your village, they have pretty good ones, right? Now, what does it mean to upscale that to a larger thing and to focus it? That has not, I don't see that in the works right now, right? But you do have the elements, the raw ingredients are there.
Well, Dr. Asheeke, there was one more question, but I'm gonna cut it here to make sure. I see some of my students on here. I know I need to get them back so they can do some work for class. But I know that you and Dr. Akinyele next May are doing a study abroad. Can you talk to us about that? And then I have one other announcement after that.
You know, I think that question actually might fold into what Rosita is asking as well. I think part of it, yeah, I actually think that is again, as I came to the program, to the department, I learned that, you know, this department has sent people to South Africa every 2 years or so. And so I think that's part of what it is, right? Sometimes people just need to go in to see places, right? And so I think that, you know, going to see some of these places is important. The department also has a Brazil program. I believe Professor Banebeli is tied to that program, and they're going to Bahia, I believe, next year, right? Bahia, historically a Black section of Brazil, although not the only Black section, right? There's a lot of Black people everywhere in Brazil, but Bahia is one of the more famous places, if you will, right? So I think part of it really is learning about these struggles, and these kind, when you're in, you know, places with levels of resources like GSU and other places, can we take people places, right? We also have ideas to go to Sapelo soon, right? They have their cultural festival, I believe, is happening sometime in mid to end of October, right? Going to these places, particularly a lot of our students who aren't from Georgia, right? We do have students who are not from Georgia, right? They don't know. They just know they have this idea of a Black Mecca coming to Atlanta. They don't know what's happening in the rest of Georgia. It's to take people down to these areas to see what other Black people are doing, to put themselves in Atlanta in some kind of context, right? And so that's part of how you build the solidarity, right? And that's what we're trying to do going to South Africa. We'll be going to Johannesburg and Cape Town. I believe it's about a 2-week trip, 2-week trip around there. Dr. Malimo Akinyele has a program already, although I do have people who I know, so we're going to put our heads together to find, you know, I want to get people to meet some EFF cats, to meet some BLF folks, meet some of the women's movements, some of the LGBTQ struggles, right? To meet some of the student movements. We're going to be trying to meet a diverse array of peoples across South Africa, and bluntly, it will be coming at a historic time next year. Like, I can't advertise it better than that. This is actually historic. I'm not sure what's going to happen. Namibia also has elections too, although I don't think we're going to have that much of an issue there, given just SWAPO is very dominant. But South Africa, that's not the case. It's going to be a historic trip, in my opinion, because I'm not sure how South Africa is going to look after this, particularly with how tense and intense the politics are right now.
Can you put your information in the chat so folks can follow up with you?
Okay, yeah. I'll put in my my GSU page, yes.
And after I make this announcement, I'd like you and the panelists to give like closing remarks. I just want to share the upcoming Freedom School. Can folks see my screen?
I can.
Okay. Of course, we had Dr. Asheeke today, Zikona Valela, will be speaking on the 28th at noon. We got Daniel Coleman speaking on Black gender. When is our existence? I can't see the last word. I'm sorry, y'all. And then on October 10th, we'll have a discussion with our Professor Masiki Scales and our student Mason Aruru on Fela Kuti. And, that should be a great conversation on Tuesday, October 10th. Martha Akawa will speak on women, gender, and the Namibian liberation struggle. Professor Julian Hill will be speaking on Black solidarity, economy lowering. And our esteemed Professor Joyce King on October 24th will be speaking on Black studies, creative, critical, collective resistance, liberating pedagogy, and in the Guardians of Heritage and Songhai Princess Clubs, project she's been doing. Then Tiffany Unique will do a book talk on Monster in the Middle. So that's coming up. So first, let's go to the panelists, just to give any closing remarks. I'll start with Comrade Coco.
All right. So I just want to say thank you for putting this together. Toivo, I really appreciate your book. Through reading some of it, I think, the part about lands, I think is an interesting concept. I do have a lot of questions about how land and independence, like maybe not having independence, prevented lands. Or not having lands and independence, I guess you can say, creates that tension and that dispossession. So I think that that's a great conversation to potentially have in the future. But yeah, I appreciate your work and the conversation today. I learned a lot. Asante Sana.
Comrades Sankara.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Thank you for the book and the intervention. This is definitely stuff that I think will be, helpful for us over here, and definitely building connections between Black liberation here and Black liberation in South Africa and in the rest of Southern Africa, because that's important. We have no excuse. We both speak English, the colonizer's language, so there's no language barrier. So yeah, appreciate your book and intervention.
And we finally, Comrade Toivo Asheeke.
Thank y'all again, Coco, Sankara. Thank y'all for taking time out of your schedules just to spend this hour and a half with us here. And for the labor you put in just to even just read parts of the book. I really do appreciate that. And again, this book really, I would say, was to be discussed with comrades. And one thing I will say in the discussion of the book with comrades, right? I do think that looking at some of the chapters on Black consciousness, trying to organize in exile, I think is very important. Because I think that we oftentimes, I don't believe in glorifying any of our history as much as I love these cats and I see them as my forebears, if you will, right? My ancestors, right? They did have conflicts and deep ones that impacted the struggle in very particular ways. And I don't think we should shy away from those kinds of things because we're living through these things now. On purpose, I did not want to deal too much with some of the ideological tensions of whether it's race first, is it class first, is it this, is it that, is it the Maoist struggle, is it this thing, is it the Marxist-Leninist? We could go into that if we wanted to, right? But I'm not saying it's not fruitful in certain areas, because sometimes it is, but I think that part of what I want to see in a different conversation, part of what I was looking for when I'm reading on the Black Panthers, when I'm reading on RAM, when I'm reading on some of the different organizations, right, the Haitian Revolution, I'm reading on the Southern African liberation struggles, is how are people negotiating and arguing through tension, right? And confronting these contradictions and just people coming from different experiences. You have a split between, for example, in exile, between those who are coming out of prison and then going into exile, and then those who weren't in prison, who left to go first in exile and have been organizing for a longer time in exile than those in prison, but those in prison are at home and they're clashing in exile. It ain't about whether it's land or whether it's who's Black and who's not Black. It actually just, I don't know you, so I don't F with you. So now it's like, how do we deal with that? When you see both sides, you can understand why both sides would be like, yeah, well, who are you? We've been here for 10 years. You know what I mean? And you coming from where? Robben Island? Well, that's nice, but I mean, we out here. So like so some of the why certain things don't happen, right? And it is important, right? But also how people do push through them is as important, right? And again, very importantly, to kind of, yes, there is a difference between armed struggle, armed resistance, and non-combative forces in particular ways, but it doesn't mean that non-combative means that you're not always on the front line. If you are hiding guerrillas in your house, you're on the front line. If you are feeding guerrillas, you're on the front line. If you are supporting activities that the guerrillas are utilizing, you are on the front line. So the reality is the front line travels through everyone, right? And what does it mean in our movements when we have glorified one wing over the other, which did happen in the African liberation movement sense? Those who were in the armed wing oftentimes got glorified in a particular way. In the armed wing and the diplomatic wing got glorified in particular ways, or put over others who were doing the grassroots, front line, day-to-day, ugly, nasty labor. And that, I think, as movement folks, we need to take more seriously, right? About how those contradictions emerge and how we need to kind of push through them, because folks before us has done the same thing. And with that, I would end. Then I would say again, amandla wetu and iswaletu I Africa.
Africa. So I just want to thank and applaud all of you, not only for your participation tonight, but your activism and participation in the struggle of our people, carrying on the struggle of our ancestors. I just want to, speaking of struggle of our ancestors, just want to pick this up, our new symbol of resistance. If you ain't got another piece, get you a chair. So with that being said, just thank everybody who came and participated tonight. Keep on top of the other programming of the Department of Africana Studies and of these brilliant scholars and activists. Stay strong, peace and power.
Free the land.
Free the land.
Stop
Any and all means necessary.
Shay.